Marvel movies are epic, but sometimes the villains just don't have enough juice to match their comic counterparts. As much as I love to see Loki being his trickster self, or Ultron wax poetically about not liking any of the new Pinocchio movies or something, the truth is that sometimes Marvel villains are way stronger in the comics. Does that end up making the movie better or worse? Let's discuss. We'll get to even bigger villains like Ultron, Hela, and Apocalypse down the line, but first you'll have to hear me talk about Loki. We're getting to that point where it's weird to call Loki a villain. Like, if Tom Hiddleston wants to, I'm sure the MCU will keep him around all the way until he can officially join the Avengers in some capacity. How crazy would that be? But while hero Loki is all the rage nowadays, we have to remember villainous Loki. You know, the version of Loki who drilled out some poor chum's eye in order to get a retina scan and then smiled at the carnage? Yeah, that guy. And even though the MCU has retconned things a bit by saying Loki was only this evil because the scepter was warping his brain, Loki did begin this series as a bad guy.
Destroy everything.
And he's definitely way stronger in the comics. Like, yes, Loki received a major power upgrade recently with the help of Sylvie and now can use his mind manipulation to a greater extent. But before that, Loki really was just mostly parlor tricks. Skilled with a blade, yes, but his main thing was creating an illusion of himself and then popping up behind you to stab you in the back. And I get it, when you stand next to Thor, of course you're gonna look a little weak in comparison, but the MCU really nerfed Loki's magical abilities. His mastery of sorcery in the comics has led to much greater problems for the Avengers in the comics. Like, do you know he was once beheaded and basically eventually walked it off? Can our Loki do that? I wasn't the biggest fan of Thor Love and Thunder, but one of the best elements was Christian Bale's performance as Gorr the God Butcher. He's the only element I wanted more of. Well, that and the screaming goats. And while he injected a strong amount of menace and gravitas to the Gorr character, I never truly felt he was a threat to Thor. And maybe that's because most of Gorr's god butchering happened off screen. All we were told is that Gorr was slaughtering gods and was super ferocious, but we didn't see any of it. And then when he was actually fighting Thor, all I could think of was that Thor had previously gone toe-to-toe with Thanos and Hela, and now this skinny guy with a sword is causing Thor problems. Now, although the performance was great, the comics Gorr is a true menacing threat. Every time Gorr and Thor meet up, Thor can barely hold his own. Maybe if Thor Love and Thunder took the time to explain just how powerful the Necro Sword really was, and were overall allowed to give it its symbiote background, and if Gorr looked right into the camera and said that the source of his power is by hitting that big like and subscribe button for CBR down right below there, then Gorr could have reached his true potential. Putting Ultron in just one MCU movie was a big mistake. The appeal of the Ultron character is that he's an AI who will keep learning, keep adapting, keep getting stronger until he reaches unimaginable levels of sentience and power. Like, you can never beat him the same way twice, and once you do beat him, it's bittersweet, because you know he's still out there backed up on a floppy disk or whatever and biding his time until he can strike again. So again, I say putting him in just one movie undercuts Ultron's greatest ability. In the MCU, sure, Ultron had an excellent James Spadery voice and was a fun level of snarky, like Tony Stark but evil, but what could he really do? He could manipulate all the computers and internet anywhere in the world, but didn't use that to his full advantage, and controlled a hive mind of faceless Ultron bots that just gave the Avengers something to punch and destroy without getting into any big moral issues about taking a henchman's life. And Vision and Hulk and all the Avengers managed to eliminate Ultron for good. But if we look to the comics, we really see the value of keeping Ultron around as he just keeps getting more powerful as time goes on. Like, at one point in the comics, Ultron could use Pym particles to shrink down to sub-microscopic levels and enter the microverse. And the comics definitely take more advantage of Ultron's ability to create and control all forms of machinery. What do you think Ultron would be like now if the Avengers never stopped him? Would he be on his way to conquering the multiverse like in that What If episode? episode? Who knows? Ego the Living Planet is one Marvel villain who I think was close to living up to his full potential. I mean, the reveal that Ego had secretly fathered children for centuries upon centuries trying to find one with his celestial genes, and then casually discarding them in his skeleton cave was one of the most brutal moments in the entire MCU. But I mean, at the end of the day, he was still just taken out by a well-placed bomb in the brain. It was so easy Baby Groot could do it. That's not exactly like Ego in the comics, who is so powerful that one arc sees him caught up in fisticuffs with Galactus. That's the power level Ego normally operates at, meaning he could be a nuisance to one of the universe's most powerful beings ever. And fun fact, at one point the High Evolutionary thought that Ego was actually just part of an even greater entity called Super Ego, who is even more insanely powerful than just regular Ego. Yeah, but comic Ego never turned into David Hasselhoff though, so I guess that's a knock against comic Ego in the end. Dormammu, I've come to bargain. I want to make you a deal. If you come back for another MCU movie and have to fight Doctor Strange in the Dark Dimension again with Clea, this time let's see the full scope of your powers. Dormammu was the big bad technically in Doctor Strange, and his impending arrival is what drove the whole movie. Caecilius wanted to merge Earth with the Dark Dimension because he was promised that Dormammu would bring like peaceful eternal life to everyone. Yeah, Caecilius, the dimensional deity from the Dark Dimension, is going to be a good guy. Look, we know to never judge a book by its cover, but yeah, Caecilius lacked common sense here. Anyways, when Dormammu finally reared his Benedict Cumberbatch looking face, he was immediately caught in a time loop until he was forced to make a pinky promise to never return to Earth again. And then he just kind of kept that promise. I mean, I guess I should give Dormammu a bit of credit for keeping his word, because he easily could have just, lied. And I will admit, Dormammu in the movie certainly looked bigger and scarier than his comic counterpart, but he never really got to show off his mastery over sorcery and all his other standard superpowers. Here's to more Dormammu in Doctor Strange 3. Do you think Thanos was a top 3 villain in the MCU? I think Infinity War Thanos certainly was, but Endgame Thanos devolved into a bit of that standard destroy the universe type of baddies for my liking. But he was an absolute powerhouse. Yes, his power levels seemed to fluctuate depending on who he was fighting, but at his peak, this is the dude who took an axe to the chest and had time to say a witty one-liner before dusting half the universe. But again, comic Thanos just seems stronger. Maybe it's because comic Thanos' motivation is so different, and that gives him a drive to just be extremely evil and powerful. Like, do you know in the comics that Thanos once created a whole army of clones of himself that were weird hybrids of robot and magic and other dark stuff? Yeah, he created them for a variety of reasons, including giving these clones powers similar to his enemies so that he could learn their weaknesses. That's the dangerous type of mindset that I felt was missing from MCU Thanos, who mostly just liked to either send minions to do his dirty work until the big Avengers movie took place, or just kind of brute forced his way forward to the Infinity Stones. Hela was actually sort of tough to put on this list because she clearly seemed like one of the most powerful enemies ever. She brought Asgard's most powerful army to their knees all by herself, crumbled Thor's hammer, took Thor's eye, and eliminated 2/3 of the Warriors 3 before they could even say enough lines to get paid a day rate. But although she was an epic warrior, her comic counterpart leaned more into the sorceress side of her deathly powers, and it made for an even stronger villain. Like, one time in the comics, Hela straight up cursed Thor in a way where his wounds wouldn't heal, but also made him immortal, creating a situation where Thor was just in agony all the time. She also has the ability to wipe out any mortal with a single touch, because, goddess of death and all that. Alright, Mysterio on this list might be a controversial choice. I get that Mysterio embracing a more tech-heavy side of his illusions in Far From Home might convince people that he was way stronger than he was in the comics, but I actually disagree. For one, MCU's Mysterio needed a whole team behind him in order to make his illusions work. It's not as impressive of a trick knowing that there's like 50 disgruntled Stark employees helping him out. Man, Tony must have just been a horrible boss, or their HR department did not do a good job in screening potential applicants. Anyways, that circles us back to Mysterio. I do think Mysterio in the comics was more powerful just because he was more successful with his individual illusions. But if you want pure power, there was one instance where Quentin Beck bonded with a piece of symbiote and then all hell broke loose. Also, comic Quentin Beck fakes his death like every other week. But you're telling me MCU Quentin Beck is just actually gone? Come on, Beck, learn to fake your death better. Like, this entry is obvious, right? Of course Malekith was stronger in the comics, because in the comics, he's actually, a character. From the movie, Malekith holds probably the best worst villain award, and he's the baddie that a lot of people pointed to early on in the MCU's run and said the MCU sorta has a villain problem, right? Well, as underwhelming as Malekith was in Thor the Dark World, in the comics, he's a great Thor villain. He's behind a lot of really great comic runs, and he's battled all sorts of heroes across the universe. Strength-wise, I guess I can't really remember how strong Malekith was in the Dark World, since I think whenever he talked I fell asleep. But in the comics, he has this magical energy manipulation that allows him to give himself all sorts of augmentations and upgrades. Here's a fun fact: in one storyline, Malekith was chosen to hold the Mandarin's spectral ring after the rings split off to find new hosts. And the ring tried to take over Malekith's mind, but Malekith was so strong that he overcame it and basically made the ring his own. I think Justin Hammer is like number one on the list of MCU villains who should return. He first appeared in Iron Man 2 as sort of a less moral, less talented Tony Stark, which was a funny in-joke as Sam Rockwell was originally in contention to play Tony Stark. So the fact that this movie didn't get to capitalize fully on Justin Hammer's potential and then just ignores him for the last decade means he's due for a comeback. Like, he's very active in the Armor Wars storyline, which we now know is getting a movie adaptation. If there was ever a time to reintroduce Justin Hammer, it's now. But please, if you bring him back, make him actually competent. There was never a true hint of menace behind Hammer in Iron Man 2, and really you were just waiting around for his discount weaponry to explode in his face. Now, I'm not saying that Hammer in the comics is physically stronger than his MCU counterpart, but he at least was a more ruthless, more cunning, more Weasley businessman than we saw on the big screen. And that's the side of the character we should focus on in the future. I know Apocalypse wasn't technically in the official MCU, but now it's all blending together, so it counts. Apocalypse is one of the greatest, most threatening Marvel bad guys ever. The first mutant, Apocalypse, lives up to his namesake in the comics and brings mass destruction wherever he goes. He's one of the X-Men's greatest enemies and should make everyone quake in their boots. But the movie version? Look, there's been tons of comparisons to Ivan Ooze, and that's not true. My only real memory of Apocalypse from that disappointing movie is when he's standing around designing cool costumes for his 4 horsemen instead of, bringing about the apocalypse. With Kang now in the MCU, I really hope we get a trip to the past and more of Apocalypse's backstory in the MCU. A few years ago, the Mandarin would have topped this list. Before Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, the only version of Mandarin that we got was the boozy Trevor Slattery, who was impersonating the big bad. You'll never see me coming. Man, that was such a good trailer. It was quite the controversial choice to have the Mandarin be fake, since the Mandarin is such a powerful villain in the comics. But now the MCU has course corrected and given us one of the greatest MCU bad guys in Wenwu, aka the Mandarin, aka Shang-Chi's father. And he's great, but the reason he's on this list is because the comic version is simply stronger. It all comes down to the rings themselves. In the comics, the rings all have unique, really deadly and powerful abilities that when combined make a true supervillain. In the MCU, so far the rings are just used as whips and force fields. Don't get me wrong, I love Shang-Chi. It's one of my favorite Phase 4 projects, but I do hope that we see a broadening of the rings' abilities in the future. Red Skull is stronger in the comics because of his resiliency. His attitude is mainly the same, but the MCU's version just was vanquished and that was that. And we know what happened now. In dealing with the Tesseract, Red Skull was punished and became a sort of ghostly guardian, forced to protect a treasure he could never possess. And while that was great to see him back, I can't help but remember fondly all those times in the comics where Red Skull cheated death by some crazy method. Sometimes his consciousness was transferred transferred into a robot body. Sometimes it was transferred into a clone of Steve Rogers' body. I'm pretty sure one time he transferred himself into a bowl of oatmeal. Maybe I'm not remembering that right. But anyways, the point is the comic Red Skull refuses to just stay down and always crawls his way back to relevance to cause more damage. I'm just saying, I think comic Red Skull would have found a way to escape from Vormir. Taskmaster is probably the most disappointing villain of Phase 4. The comic Taskmaster is a truly powerful threat, with him being one of the best martial artists in the entire Marvel catalog. It's because he's mastered every form of fighting ever created, along with being an expert marksman and tactician and strategist, all that jazz. The only thing holding him back really is the amount of information he can hold in his head. The MCU Taskmaster did look pretty cool, but I don't think the character's skills were truly put to the test. Yeah, he posed a few times like Captain America, Black Panther, and Black Widow, but I just wanted more. Maybe it's because the character was brainwashed the entire time and not operating on her own free will, but I'm really excited for Thunderbolts because I think it's going to be where Taskmaster truly shines. And finally, Yellowjacket. Let's just talk about Yellowjacket in the first Ant-Man movie and not Darren Cross later on in the MCU. Yellowjacket / Darren Cross in the comics was more of a successful businessman and just generally a more desperate dude than he was portrayed in the first Ant-Man movie. That's because of his heart disease that led to a nucleo-organic pacemaker being placed inside of him, which, shocker, had side effects. It made him just generally more powerful and gave him superhuman senses so he could see insect-sized targets, which is incredibly helpful when fighting Ant-Man, and just in general got enhanced strength and a regenerative healing factor. Which deceased villain do you think deserves the best chance to redeem themselves with a surprise resurrection in the MCU? Can they ever meet the lofty standards set by their comic counterparts? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching CBR. See you next time.